In this video, we're going to complete the KutaSoftware Infinite Pre-Algebra free worksheet, fractions, decimals, and percents. And this is converting between those. So for our first part, numbers 1 through 8, we're going to write each as a decimal. Now remember, the conversion between a percent and a decimal, well, if we start at a decimal and want to get to a percent, we multiply the decimal by 100. So to convert from a percent to a decimal, we're going to divide by 100. Now the nice thing about dividing by 100 is the fact that all we need to do in order to divide by 100 is move the decimal place 2 to the left. So let's jump into number 1. For 90%, the decimal is after that whole number, 90%. So if we divide by 100, we move the decimal once and then twice to the left. So the new decimal point now goes in front of the 9. So this will be 0. I like to have a 0 placeholder in front of my decimal. 0.9. So 0.9 or 9/10 is the solution in number 1. Moving on to number 2, we have 30%. So again, that decimal is after the 30 right now, and we're going to move it over twice in front of the 3. So this will be 0.3 or 3/10. And if you notice, I'm dropping off this 0 on the right hand side that comes after the 3 because 30 hundredths is the same as 3/10. That 0 is unnecessary, so I'm not going to put it in. In number 3, we can see that we have 115 and 9/10%. So the decimal place is right here. We're going to move it 2 times, 1, 2, to the left, so we're dividing by 100. This will leave us with 1.159 as our decimal in number 3, or 1 and 159 thousandths. And number 4, our decimal, since it's not given to us, occurs after the whole number 9. So this is 9%. So I'm going to move my decimal 2 to the right, 1, 2, and notice that we're going to have a placeholder 0. This 0 will be important. So we'll have 0.09. If we didn't include this 0, we would have 0.9, which is not the same as 9%. 9% is 9 hundredths. So this placeholder 0 is very important. We cannot forget that. So 9 hundredths. And think about it. 9% is like saying 9 out of 100. So we want that decimal to be 9 hundredths. Same kind of concept as in number 4 with number 5. We have 7%, so our decimal place is here, but we're moving it twice to the left, once in front of the 7, and then once more beyond that. So we need to include a 0. So for this, we'll have 0.07 or 7 hundredths as our decimal. In number 6, 65%, my decimal moving 2 to the left is going to be 0.65 or 65 hundredths. I have 0.3% or 3/10 of a percent. So I'm going to need to still move my decimal place 2 times to the left. So once beyond that 0 and then once more to the left. So we're going to have a 0 in front of the 0, which is in front of the 3. So this is going to be 0.003 or 3 thousandths. That's our decimal. So you can see the zeros after the decimal, but still in front of a digit between 1 and 9 are important. Any zeros that come after are insignificant, unless they fall in front of another digit between 1 and 9. And lastly, for this section, 445%. My decimal is after the 5. Moving it over twice, I'll get 4.45 or 4 and 45 hundredths. Now, for this next set of directions, we're just going to be writing each as a percent, and we're going to round to the nearest tenth of a percent. So as opposed to dividing by 100, we're now going to multiply by 100. So in order to change the decimal to a percent, we're now moving the decimal point 2 to the right. That gives us the percent. Going from percent to a decimal, that's 2 to the left. So if our decimal is here in number 9, moving it once, twice, so this is going to be 45.2% for number 9. For number 10, moving the decimal 2 to the right, we're going to go 1, 2, and place it here. So it's unnecessary to say 0.6%. We'll drop 2 of those zeros off the front because they do nothing to the value of our number. So this is 0.6%. And number 11, very similar to number 10, we're moving this decimal place twice to the right. Remember, to the right because we're converting between a decimal and a percent. So this becomes 0.2% in number 11. In number 12, 0.05 or 5/100ths. In order to turn that into a percent, we move the decimal 2 to the right. So this becomes 5%. For number 13, again, we're moving that decimal how many to the right? 2, because we're multiplying our decimal by 100, so we move that decimal point 2 to the right. So this becomes 478% for number 13. 4 7/78 becomes 478%. And number 14, think about this. This decimal is 1/10. So 1/10 becomes, filling in that placeholder, 10%. 1/10 becomes 10%. Or we can think of this decimal as 10/100ths. So when we move that decimal point 2 times to the right, 10/100ths is 10%. 3 63/100ths, moving that decimal 2 to the right, we get 363%. And then lastly in this section, number 16, we're moving that decimal point again 2 to the right because we're converting between a decimal and a percent. So going from decimal to percent, multiplying by 100, we get 3% for the last number in this section on our worksheet. Now, moving on to the next page, we're now going to convert between percents to fractions. So writing each fraction as a percent is easier than you think. Because remember, converting between decimals and percents, we're either multiplying by 100 or dividing by 100. So if we're trying to write a percent as a fraction, it's like that number out of 100. Because remember, to convert between a percent to a decimal, we divide by 100. So this is 25 over 100. And now all we need to do is simplify this step. Now the easiest way to simplify down 25 into 100, I know that that's going to be 1/4. And the way I like to think about this is how many times does 25 go into 25? That's once. And how many times does 25 go into 100? That's 4. So this becomes 1/4. Now for number 18, 70%, we're going to write 70 over 100. Now both of these, both the numerator and denominator, are divisible by 10 because they each have a 0 in them. So dividing 70 by 10 and dividing 100 by 10, I will get 7/10. So 7/10 is my simplified fraction for 70%. And also, if you want to think about it this way, if you were to convert 70% to a decimal, dividing by 100, we're moving that 2 to the left, that decimal would be 0.7, which, when you read it, is 7/10. Here we go, 7/10. So I'm throwing a lot of different information at you just so that you have different ways to think about these problems. That way, if you understand one way a little bit more than doing it the way I'm doing it on my worksheet, feel free to do it the way you feel most comfortable. Now, in number 19, we have 93%. So that's 93 over 100. And there's no way to simplify this fraction down because there's no factors that match between 93 and 100. Both are not divisible by the same number with the exclusion of 1. Therefore, there's no way to simplify them down. In number 20, we have 58%, which 58% is 58 over 100. Now, both of these are even numbers, and I know that even numbers are divisible by 2. So if I divide 58 by 2, I'll get 29. And if I divide 100 by 2, I'll get 50. Now, between 29 and 50, there's no numbers in common that divide both of them. Therefore, 29/50ths is my solution in number 20. In number 21, 50%. 50% is 50 over 100. Both are divisible by 10, as you can tell by both ending in a 0. So dividing 50 by 10 and dividing 100 by 10, I get 5/10. Now 5/10 is a more simplified version of 50 out of 100, but 5/10 can also be simplified down because 5 goes into both 5 and 10. So if I divide my numerator by 5, I get 1, and if I divide my denominator by 5, I get 2. So 5/10 is equal to 1/2. So 50% is 1/2. Now number 22 is a bit trickier because we have 66.6 repeating. So if we were to write this over 100, that would be 66.6 over 100. So now you can see we're mixing fractions and decimals, which gets a little messy. So when dividing by 100, think about moving that decimal place over twice. So now we have 0.666 repeating, which this means repeating, meaning that it goes on forever. So this I can rewrite as just 0.6 repeating because all I have are 6's and it continues on. That's the same as 0.6 repeating. Now for the sake of this video, I'm going to teach you a trick. If we have 1/9, that's equal to 0.1 repeating. If we have 2/9, that's equal to 0.2 repeating. If we have 3/9, can you guess what it is? 0.3 repeating. So if we have 0.6 repeating, what do you think that is? If that pattern continues on, 0.6 repeating is 6/9. So 66.6 repeating over 100 is 6/9, which 6 and 9 are both divisible by what number? 3. 3 goes into 6 2 times, and 3 goes into 9 3 times. So 2/3 is our solution in number 22. In number 23, we have 20%. So that's 20 out of 100. And 20 out of 100, well, both are divisible by 10, so that becomes 2/10. And both of those are divisible by 2. So 2 goes into 2 once, and 2 goes into 10 5 times. So 20% is equivalent to 1/5. Now for number 24, we have 80%. So again, that's 80 over 100. And if we have 80 over 100, both are divisible by 10. So that leaves us with 8/10. And then from there, both are divisible by 2. 2 goes into 8 4 times, and 2 goes into 10 5 times. 4/5 is 80% as a fraction. And number 25, we have 71%, so we can write that as 71 over 100. And there's not a number where both 71 and 100 can be divided by that same number. Well, with the exclusion of 1, but dividing 71 by 1 is 71, and dividing 100 by 1 is still 100. So there's no way to simplify this fraction down. 71 over 100 is our fraction. 71 hundredths. So again, think about it this way. If we have our decimal place here and moved it 2 times to the left, that would be 0.71. Reading this decimal, if you practice how decimals are to be read, that's 71 hundredths. And lastly, for this section, 30%. So we have 30 over 100. Both are divisible by 10. So 30 divided by 10 is 3, and 100 divided by 10 is 10. 3/10 is our solution for 30%. And if we were to write 30% as a decimal, we'd move that decimal place 2 times to the left to be 0.3. How would you read this decimal? It would be read as 3/10. Now in this next section, we're going to write each as a percent. And we're going to use repeating decimals when necessary. Now I will say a good double check is that we've done some of these problems already up above. But the way to convert a fraction to a percent is to be able to think of it almost like a decimal. So something out of 100. So what I want to do is try to create these to be as opposed to over some random denominator. So for example, in number 27, we have this as over 2. I want to make this either over 10 or over 100, because once I have that, I'd be able to write it as a decimal and convert to a percent from there. Does 2 go into 10? Yeah. How do I get from 2 to 10? I have to multiply by 5. So if I multiply my denominator by 5, I need to multiply my numerator by 5. So this is going to be 5/10. So 5/10 is written as 0.5, and converting that, moving that decimal place twice, that's going to be 50%. So 50% is our solution in number 27. We could also have converted this to something out of 100, because once we have that number out of 100, that is our percent. So 10 times what gets us 100? That's 10 times 10. So all we would need to do is to multiply 5 by 10 to get 50 over 100, 50%. So you can either turn the fraction into a decimal and then convert, or turn that fraction into something out of 100 and then write it as your percent. Let's practice that method with number 28. Does 8 go into 100? No, not quite. So we're going to see how many times 8 does go into 100. So if I take 100 and divide it by 8, doing a little bit of long division, 8 does not go into 1, but 8 does go into 10. And 8 goes into 10 one time. Now remember, 1 times 8 is 8, so I'm going to subtract that, carrying down my 0. So 10 minus 8 is 2, bring down that 0, 20. Or I can think about this as 100 minus 80. Now I need to see how many times 8 goes into 20. 8 goes into 20 2 times. 2 times 8 is 16. So now I'm going to subtract 16 from 20. 20 minus 16 leaves me with 4. Now I know that 8 doesn't go into 4, but I can carry down a 0 and see how many times 8 goes into 40. But remember, in order to place that 0, I had to put a decimal point, so I'm going to keep it in line as well. So 8 goes into 40 5 times, because 8 times 5 is 40. So you can see I have nothing left over to deal with. So 8 goes into 100 12.5 times. So if I multiply 8 by 12.5, I'll get 100. Which means if I multiply my denominator by 12.5, I need to multiply my numerator by 12.5. 1 times 12.5 is 12.5. So 12.5 out of 100 is 12.5%. Now, if you were confused on that long division, please feel free to go back and review one of my long division tutorial videos. Or now that you've walked through it with me, cover up your work and try it again on your own to make sure you really understand that long division. But for now, let's continue on. In number 29, we have 2/3. Now I remember from above that 2/3, if you look back up at number 22, was 66.6 repeating percent. So I already know my solution in number 29. However, let's think about how many times 3 goes into 100. Well, if I have 100 and I divide it by 3, some more long division, so if you need the practice, slow this video down or try it on your own at first and double check with my work. So 3 goes into 1, well it doesn't, but 3 goes into 10, how many times? 3 times. So 3 goes into 10 3 times, so I'm going to be subtracting 9 from 10, which leaves me with 1. And then I'm going to bring down this 0. Again, I have a 10. How many times does 3 go into 10? Again, that's 3. So I'm going to be subtracting 9. 10 minus 9 is 1. Now notice, if I put my decimal place in here and bring down that 0, keeping my decimals in line, I get another 10. How many times does 3 go into 10? 3 times. Subtract 3 times 3, which is 9. Again, I get a 1, putting a 0. You can see that this pattern will continue on. So 3 times 33.3 repeating, because that's going to continue on, gives me 100. That was my denominator, so that means my numerator I'm going to have to multiply 2 times 33.3 repeating as well. 2 times 33.3 repeating is going to be 66.6 repeating. So you can see 66.6 repeating out of 100 becomes 66.6 repeating percent. Let's continue on to an easier one, number 30. Number 30 is nice because it's already set up for us to write it as percent. 1 out of 100 is 1%. If we wanted to think of this as a decimal first, 1/100th is 0.01. Moving that decimal place twice would give us 1%. Getting close to the end of this worksheet, only 4 more problems left. So in number 31, we have 2 and 1/10. So here they're mixing this up just a bit by giving us a mixed number. But think about it, if we have 2 wholes and then 1/10, that's 2.1. 2 and 1/10. Moving that decimal place twice and filling in that 0, this will be 210%. Another way to deal with this mixed number is if we have 2 and 1/10, I'll create one big fraction with it. 2 and 1/10 is the same as, well, 2 times 10 is going to be 20, right? So if I had 20 over 10, that is 2, because both are divisible by 10. 2 divided by 1 is 2. But because I have a mixed fraction, I have to add that to 1/10. So this is 21 over 10. That is equivalent to 2 and 1/10. Now I don't want my fraction necessarily over 10, I want it over 100. So I need to multiply my denominator by 10 and my numerator by 10 to get 210 over 100, so 210%. In number 32, we have 3/8. Now if you remember from number 28, 8 goes into 100 12.5 times. So I have to multiply by 12.5 to get 100 in my denominator, which means I need to multiply my numerator by that same thing so I don't change the value of my overall fraction. So 3 times 12.5, let's do out some multiplication. 12.5 times 3 is the same as 3 times 12.5, so I'll write it like this. 5 times 3 is 15, carry the 1, 2 times 3 is 6, plus 1 is 7, and then 1 times 3 is 3. Now note, I multiplied a decimal by a whole number, so I have one decimal place. So if I get 375, I need to make sure I account for that decimal place. So 37.5. So this will be 37.5 over 100, or 37.5%. Second to last problem, number 33. 1/10, well, 1/10 in decimal form is just like it sounds, 1/10. Moving that decimal twice, I get 10%. So 10% is my solution in number 33. The other way we can do this, if I take my original fraction 1/10, I need to multiply my numerator and denominator both by 10. Because 10 times 10 gives me 100 in my denominator, and 1 times 10 gets me 10 in my numerator. 10 100ths, well, that's 10%. Final one on this worksheet is a pretty easy one because we're already over 100, so we just look at the numerator and put that percent sign with it. 87%. And that's my final solution on this worksheet. Hopefully you found this video helpful. If you did, give me a thumbs up. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the comments below, and I or one of your peers will get back to you as soon as we can. But as always, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share.